Welcome to another deep dive. We'll be exploring a fascinating connection. It's where art meets music. We're looking at Peter Bruegel, the elder's famous painting, The Triumph of Death. But we're going to look at it a little differently today. Through sound, through the soundscapes of Ralf Graeber. He's an artist and a natural philosopher.
Yeah, it's a really cool concept. I mean, most people know this painting, right? Bruegel's masterpiece, just that huge scene of skeletons just wreaking havoc. It's so visually striking. But Graeber goes a step further with it. He argues that to really get it, to get the deeper meaning of the painting, we need to hear it.
So we're kind of adding another whole dimension to this artwork, like beyond what we see with our eyes.
Exactly. It's like the triumph of death isn't just something visual. It's something we can hear. He uses sounds and tones and music to make that point, that death is there in our ears too, not just our eyes.
That's a really different way to think about it. Can we kind of go back to the painting for a second? Like for people who maybe haven't seen it in a while.
Oh, yeah, sure. So the triumph of death. Bruegel painted it around 1562, and if you want to see it, you have to go to the Museo del Prado in Madrid. It's massive. This huge painting with so much detail. You've got this landscape, really desolate. It kind of feels apocalyptic. And there's skeletons everywhere, just destroying everything. There's this hell oven blazing away in the distance. Ships are sinking, and there's a king on his knees, a skeleton's holding up an hourglass. You know his time's up. There's even this feast, and like the skeletons are interrupting it, plates are overturned, the music's stopped. It's chaos.
Yeah, it sounds overwhelming. Even just like hearing you describe it, you really get that sense of chaos, like it's unavoidable.
Exactly, and this is what makes Graeber so interesting. He doesn't just use sounds from the 16th century. He uses modern music and modern sounds so that we really feel it today.
Because he's kind of connecting Bruegel's time to our own time through these sounds.
Yeah, and it works. Think about that scene with the king in the hourglass. We see the skeleton, death, holding the hourglass. Time's running out. But then add the sound, like these frantic strings, like really discordant. As the skeletons get closer to the king, like the tension builds and builds. It's scary. And then when that last grain of sand falls, silence. Total silence. That's the finality of death. That stillness after all the chaos.
Wow, that's just powerful. The way that sound can be used, it's not just like describing something. It makes you feel it.
Exactly. Graeber gets it. He understands that death is something we experience with our whole being, not just our eyes. And sound is a huge part of that.
It seems like Bruegel and Graeber are saying the same thing, that death is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter who you are, we all face it.
Oh, definitely. That's like the main theme here. You look at the painting and it's the king, the cardinal, the peasant. They're all going to die. Even the people having a good time, like the musicians at the feast. They don't even see the skeleton right there beside them.
It's like even when you're celebrating, living your life, death is right there waiting.
Right, and that's where Graeber's soundscapes could be so cool. Imagine if there was this musical theme. That kept coming back, no matter what else you were hearing. Maybe a cello. Or a really deep drum.
It would be like this constant reminder that death is always there.
Yeah.
Behind everything.
That's a great way to put it. Graeber doesn't just bring the painting to life. He adds this whole other layer of meaning. He makes you understand what Bruegel was really saying.
It's really interesting how he uses sound to like unlock those hidden parts of the artwork.
Yeah.
It's making me think about it in a whole new way.
That's what's so great about it. He's not just adding sound effects. He's making you engage with the art. It's almost like you feel it in your gut. And it's not just like the big themes that Graeber brings out. With sound, he really pays attention to all the little details too, the little scenes in the painting.
Oh, I'm curious about that. We talked about the king with the hourglass, but there's so much more in there. Like what other parts would he focus on?
Well, look at the skeletal fisherman, for example. He's not catching fish, though. It's people. Their bodies are all tangled up in the net, being pulled towards the shore.
God, that's creepy. How would Graeber how would he make that into a sound?
Distorted?
With the sound.
Right. And it makes you think about the decisions he'd have to make. Like,
Nah.
What kind of music would he even use? Would it be strings or maybe something more percussive? Like, with every sound would have to be chosen really carefully to give you the right emotion, that feeling of fear or that unease.
Like he's writing a symphony of death, and each scene is like a different movement.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And we can't forget about the skeletal coachman. He's driving his cart over all these bodies, and he's playing this hurdy-gurdy, like he doesn't even notice all the death under the wheels.
That part always got to me. It's just so macabre. You've got this happy music, but then this awful thing happening.
And Graeber could do so much with that. Like you'd hear the hurdy-gurdy, all creaky and wheezing, but then underneath you do.
It's just So haunting. And even more disturbing when you add the sound.
Yeah.
Speaking of haunting, we have to talk about the feast.
Oh, yeah. That scene is amazing. So much going on visually and for sound. It's like this picture of life. There's music. People are laughing and eating and drinking, and then
it's like life is so fragile. Joy can just turn into terror, just like that.
Glasses clinking, people talking, and then when the skeletons come in, the music, S-T-O-P-S, the loop strings are cut. Maybe you hear swords clashing, people screaming, plates breaking, and then this high-pitched laugh from the skeleton pouring the wine.
God, that laugh would be so creepy. Like death is mocking us.
Yeah.
It doesn't care about our parties, our good times. It's still coming.
And that goes back to the point Bruegel and Graeber are making. We can't escape death. It doesn't matter who we are.
Kind of a downer, but makes you appreciate the good times more, while they last.
Oh, definitely. Graeber's not trying to make us sad. I think he wants us to really live.
Yeah.
To enjoy every moment.
Like he's saying, hey, listen up to the sounds of life while you can, because someday it'll just be silence.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Like, this painting is so old, hundreds of years old, and Graeber makes it feel so current, so relevant to us. Like, we don't have to worry about the same things as people back then, but death, we all get that. We all have to face that.
Right. That's what's so cool about this. Graeber's not trying to make it sound old. He's using modern music, modern sounds to get at those, like basic human feelings, fear, uncertainty, acceptance, when we think about our own death.
So it's not just about understanding Bruegel or his painting. It's about understanding ourselves. Like, where do WE fit in with this whole life and death thing?
Yeah, and that's what art is all about. It connects us across time, across different cultures. We see ourselves in these other people, even if they lived so long ago.
It's the one thing that really sticks with you from this whole thing about the triumph of death for me. But then this horrible thing is happening. We try to ignore death. We try to forget about it with music, with laughter, with just staying busy.
Yeah.
But it's always there.
Yeah. It's like death isn't something that happens to other people. It's part of life. It's going to happen to all of us.
And the way Graeber does it, with the sound, it makes it so much more real, so much more immediate.
Like, you can't ignore it. You have to listen. Not just with your ears, but with your whole self, though. So
here's something to think about. What if Graeber made a soundscape for you, for your life? What would it sound like? What music would he use for the happy times, the sad times, your wins, your losses? What instruments would he choose?
It's a deep question. Makes you think maybe it would help us understand ourselves better, our own journey through life.
Ralf Graeber, who is interpreting it through music.
That's a really fascinating combo, to have a centuries-old masterpiece and then have this modern interpretation of it through music. I think it really speaks to, just this enduring power that art has to, confront these anxieties that we have and, especially the anxiety surrounding mortality.
For sure. And looking at the sources that you sent me, it's interesting to see how, even though these artists are working in such different mediums and, different time periods, they still seem to be grappling with this idea of death as like an inevitability.
Yeah, for sure. That's a huge theme that runs through both the triumph of death and Graeber's interpretation. And New Notice actually says, highlights this point with this quote that I think is really chilling. Death encounters the artist couple.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is a chilling image.
Yeah.
I mean, to think that even, someone who seemingly is defying death through this creative work can't escape this.
Right.
It really kind of sets the stage for these larger questions about, what role does art play in helping us process this inevitability?
Yeah, I mean, does art offer us solace when we're thinking about death, or is it merely a distraction or a way to just temporarily shield ourselves from this fear of the unknown?
Right. There's a quote that speaks to that in New Notice, which is, so, does art give us hope to overcome or suppress death, although fear and anxiety remain?
Right? It's like it's suggesting that even if art can't conquer death, maybe it can offer us a way to kind of engage with it and explore those anxieties and maybe even find some meaning in all that fear.
Right. I'm thinking, art has been used for centuries to try to make sense of death.
Right.
It's almost like it's this safe space to, confront something that we typically avoid in our day-to-day lives.
I think that's a key point. Both Bruegel and Graeber, in their own ways, seem to be unpacking these complex emotions surrounding death using their specific mediums.
Yeah, and they do it in a way that's both unsettling and captivating.
Yeah.
New Notice actually says, so like the irony arises from the fact that death, A serious and unavoidable reality stands in the role of a skeleton in the background of the artists and with a musical instrument that is still laughing.
Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah.
The image of death playing music, almost mockingly while standing amidst these artists.
Right.
It really, I think, speaks to this idea that death is not just this passive force. It's an active presence that intrudes on our lives, even our creative pursuits.
Yeah, it's like death is saying, you can try to create beauty and meaning, but I'm always lurking in the shadows just waiting to have the last laugh.
Exactly. And I think this is really where Graeber's musical interpretation adds a fascinating layer to Bruegel's work.
Okay.
Because it brings in this element of music which can really, amplify or even challenge our understanding of death, especially when it's paired with such a powerful visual piece like Bruegel's painting.
So the music is brilliant because music and sounds cannot be processed in pictures and paintings, but can only be alluded to.
Right. And I think what's so cool is that Graeber uses music to kind of bring in elements that Bruegel can only suggest visually. So, for example, the passage of time, the fleeting nature of life, or even the eerie silence that might follow death's arrival. Those are things that music can really express so powerfully.
So it's like music is adding this very visceral and emotional dimension to what is already a very impactful image.
I think that's a great way to put it. Yeah, it's almost as if Graeber's music is giving a voice to the silent figures in the painting, allowing us to hear their stories and their fears and, maybe even their acceptance of the inevitable.
Right. And that brings us to another theme that I noticed throughout both pieces, which is this idea of denial versus confrontation.
Right.
When it comes to death, both artists seem to be exploring how people, and artists in particular, grapple with their own mortality.
Yeah, and Neue Notiz actually touches on this and has this really interesting quote, which is, so it's saying, the death depicted questions the usual idea of death as something dignified or sublime, in that death mocks the frightened artists, imitating the artist's behavior as if in a mirror.
Wow, that's another chilling image.
Yeah.
To think that death is mocking these people who are trying to deny or escape it.
Right.
Makes me think about how artists, through their work, are seeking this kind of immortality.
Right.
A way to leave their mark on the world that will outlive them.
But at the same time, both Bruegel and Graeber seem to be suggesting that even art can't ultimately conquer death. It's kind of a sobering thought.
Yeah.
But maybe there's a deeper message here about acceptance and finding meaning within the limits of our finite existence.
All right, before we move on, I want to touch on how Graeber's modern interpretation makes this centuries-old theme relevant for us today.
Yeah. Neue Notiz says that Graeber's work and appeals directly to the people of the present time because the statements of the work are aimed at those who are close to the work of art as viewers and listeners from the outside. So it's really highlighting how art has this incredible ability to transcend time.
For sure.
Even though Graeber is working with a 16th century painting, he's finding a way to connect with modern audiences in this really personal way.
Right. It shows that these questions surrounding death and our attempt to try and make sense of it are just as relevant today as they were centuries ago.
Absolutely.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
We have.
From the universality of death to the role of art in helping us confront our fears.
Yes.
But we've only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah, there's so much more to uncover and explore when we look at the details of both Bruegel's painting and Graeber's musical reinterpretation. I wanted to pick back up on something you mentioned earlier about artists seeking immortality through their work.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? They're confronting death in their art, but at the same time, they're maybe hoping to transcend it through creation.
It is interesting. It makes me think back to that quote from Neue Notiz about death mimicking the artist, almost mocking them for trying to deny it.
Right. It's like death is saying, your efforts to create, to leave some legacy behind, are meaningless in the face of my power.
Exactly.
I'm struck by that visual of death mirroring the artist's actions. What do you think Bruegel was trying to convey with that?
I think he's really trying to highlight how futile it is to try and escape death. It's a reminder that no matter what we accomplish in life, death is ultimately going to win.
Right.
It is. And, that sense of being controlled, of being powerless against this bigger force is probably amplified in Graeber's musical interpretation.
No.
Well, imagine, for instance, this delicate melody representing the artist's creative spirit, and then suddenly it's interrupted by this harsh, dissonant chord symbolizing death's arrival. Or maybe there's a musical motif that's repeated throughout the piece, and it gets more and more frantic as the scenes in the painting unfold.
Okay.
Mirroring, the increasing dread that the characters are feeling.
Right. So it's adding a layer of emotion and really making the audience feel the fear and the helplessness of these characters in a more immediate way.
Exactly. And it brings us back to the question we asked before. If art can't conquer death, then what role does it play in helping us cope with it?
Right. It seems pretty clear that both Bruegel and Graeber don't think that art can defeat death. So what are they trying to tell us?
Maybe it's not about conquering death, but confronting it, understanding it, and finding meaning in its presence.
So we shouldn't deny death, but instead face it head on and try to find a way to accept it.
Exactly. We need to reconcile ourselves to the fact that we're all going to die. And I think art can help us with that.
So by exploring these ideas through art, we can gain a new perspective, one that allows us to see death as a natural part of life instead of something to be afraid of.
Right.
Do you think art can actually help us find peace or understanding when it comes to death?
Yeah, I do. I think it provides us with a safe space to explore these existential questions that we tend to avoid in our everyday lives. It allows us to work through these heavy emotions and maybe even come to some kind of resolution.
So it's like having a conversation with death, not to defeat it, but to understand it, to figure out a way to live alongside it.
I like that. And maybe through that conversation, we can actually start to appreciate life more, you know, recognize how precious and fragile it is.
Yeah. You're only here for a limited amount of time, so make the most of it.
Exactly.
This has been a really thought-provoking conversation. It's really made me realize how much art has to offer beyond just, beauty and aesthetics.
Absolutely. Art can challenge our assumptions, expand our worldview, help us grapple with these big questions about life and death.
Definitely. Before we wrap up, I would love to hear from our listeners. Have you ever encountered a piece of art that has helped you make sense of death or mortality?
Yeah, share your thoughts with us on our social media. We're always curious to hear how art resonates with our audience.
Now let's shift gears a little bit and focus on some of the specific details in Bruegel's The Triumph of Death and in Graeber's musical interpretation.
Okay, sounds good.
I'm particularly fascinated by how Bruegel depicts death as this overwhelming force that just cuts across all social classes.
Yeah, that sense of universality is definitely key here. Bruegel is showing us how death affects every single person regardless of their status or their wealth. And Graeber's music likely amplifies that feeling of inevitability.
In what way?
Well, maybe he uses a recurring theme that weaves its way through the entire piece, representing death's constant presence. Or maybe there's a gradual transition from these light, hopeful melodies to something much darker and more foreboding as the events in the painting unfold.
It's interesting to think about how music can layer these extra meanings onto an already powerful image.
Yeah, it really shows the power of art to work on multiple levels, engaging our senses and emotions in a way that you just can't do with words.
There's so many details in this painting that I could get lost in, but there's one that really stands out to me. The scene where death is shown playing a musical instrument surrounded by all these corpses.
Yeah, it's a really striking image. It's almost as if death is mocking the whole idea of art and creation.
Like it's saying, yeah, you can create all this stuff, but I'm still going to win in the end.
Right, exactly. And I think Graeber's interpretation probably adds another layer to that.
How so?
Well, imagine the music in that scene. It's probably this haunting melody played on some distorted instrument that just echoes this emptiness and finality of death.
Oh, wow. That would be chilling.
Yeah, it would be. And I think it's a reminder that even when we're at our most creative, death still has the final say.
But maybe there's a message of hope within that reality.
What do you mean?
Well, if death really is the end, then maybe that should encourage us to appreciate the time that we have and the beauty of life even more.
That's a beautiful way to look at it. And it really highlights how art can help us change our perspective. So instead of seeing death as the end, we can see it as a part of the natural cycle of life.
A transition to something unknown,
Right.
but not something to be afraid of.
Exactly.
This deep dive has really taken us on a journey. We've explored the depths of human creativity and our fascination with death.
We have. It's been quite a ride.
What are some final thoughts you want to leave the listener with? That's a good point. So it's really about finding art that speaks to you personally, that challenges you, and makes you think about the big questions.
Exactly. And if you haven't already, I highly recommend checking out both Bruegel's painting, The Triumph of Death, and Graeber's musical interpretation.
You might be surprised by what you discover.
Yeah, you never know.
Welcome back to our final segment. We've been discussing how both Bruegel and Graeber use art to explore death.
Right.
But I'm curious about the how. What are the choices that they're making in their respective mediums that are really bringing this theme to life?
Well, in Bruegger's case, I think the sheer scale and the detail of the Triumph of Death are really crucial. He's not just showing us death,
Right.
he's immersing us in it.
Yeah.
The entire canvas is just teeming with these skeletal figures, and they're just overwhelming the living in almost every single corner. It's chaotic, it's relentless, and it leaves the viewer with this sense of inescapable dread.
Yeah, it's not subtle at all.
No, not at all.
And it really, connects back to what Nui no Tus was saying about how Bruegel's depiction of death challenges these conventional notions of dignity or sublimity.
Exactly. Death isn't this, somber, cloaked figure. It's grotesque, it's mocking, and it's participating in all the everyday activities of the living, which makes it so unsettling.
Right. And I imagine that Graeber's music would just heighten this feeling of unease.
Oh, absolutely.
Can you paint a picture for us sonically of how his music would interact with these visuals?
Well, let's think about the color palette for a second. The painting has a lot of browns and yellows and grays,
Right.
all of which create this sense of decay and lifelessness.
Mm.
Graeber could reflect that in the music through these dissonant harmonies, just to evoke that same feeling of bleakness. Huh.
I see. We were talking before about how Nu Notes mentions how music can kind of capture those elements that are only hinted at in a painting.
Yeah.
How do you think Graeber might be using that to his advantage here?
Well, imagine a scene where you see people fleeing in terror from these approaching skeletons.
Okay.
Visually, we see the chaos and the fear,
Right.
but Graeber can add this whole other layer of emotional depth with like a really frantic, almost breathless melody that really gets at the character's desperate struggle for survival, which is something you can't really express visually.
It's like their silent screams are given a voice through the music.
Exactly. It makes it so much more intense for the listener.
Yeah. Do you think he would directly quote any of the sounds that we see in the painting? Like the instruments that Death is playing?
It's possible, but I think it's more likely that he would use those as a starting point. Create these musical motifs that evoke those sounds, but in a way that's more distorted or unsettling. Like we were talking about before, music can't replicate the visuals exactly, but it can reinterpret them in really powerful ways.
I'm also curious about the overall structure of Graeber's interpretation.
Yeah.
Do you think it would follow the painting chronologically or take a more abstract approach?
That's a good question. I mean, he could really mirror that scattered, chaotic composition of the painting with these really fragmented melodies and abrupt shifts in tone,
Yeah.
really enhance that sense of unease and unpredictability. Or he could choose to really zone in on certain scenes or characters and use these leitmotifs to represent their struggles and their ultimate demise.
So many possibilities.
There really are. And I think, that's what makes art so amazing and allows for so many interpretations. And it really encourages us to engage with it on this personal level.
Yeah, this has been such a powerful reminder of how art can help us grapple with these really difficult subjects like death. What are your final thoughts for our listeners today?
Well, if you haven't already, I highly encourage you to check out Bruegel's Triumph of Death and experience Graeber's musical interpretation for yourself.
Okay.
And, don't shy away from the uncomfortable emotions that these pieces might bring up.
Yeah, sometimes facing our fears can lead to the most profound insights about ourselves and the world around us.
Absolutely. And remember, art provides this safe space for exploration and contemplation.
Right.
So allow yourselves to be challenged, to question, and to find your own meaning in these incredibly powerful works.
Well, we hope this deep dive has provided you with some fresh perspectives on art, death, and the power of human creativity.
We have. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Even though, death is coming for us all.